So fellas, we've just had the last pay-per-view of the UFC in 2024, so I thought it'd be the perfect time to go through every UFC pay-per-view that we've had this year and rank them all from worst to best. We've had some pretty good pay-per-views this year. We've also had some pretty bad pay-per-views and some terrible fights, so we're going to be ranking every UFC pay-per-view that's taken place this year in 2024 from worst to best. And we'll start off with what is, in my opinion, the worst pay-per-view that we've had this year, and it's UFC 302. I think this was the worst pay-per-view we've had this year. A lot of people see the main event between Makhachev and Poirier, and they might think, you know, what am I on about? But if you actually look at this pay-per-view, it was a terrible pay-per-view. The good thing about this pay-per-view is that Islam versus Poirier was a banger. That saved the pay-per-view. If that fight wouldn't have been good, this would have been one of the worst pay-per-views of all time. It was a really good fight between Poirier and Makhachev. Makhachev was dominating Poirier for the most part, but the fact that Poirier actually survived until round 5 was impressive. There was a couple of times when he clipped Makhachev. We got to see Makhachev stand up until he submitted Dustin Poirier, put him to sleep. It was a really good back and forth fight, ending with a finish for Islam Makhachev. So the good thing about UFC 302, the main event was a banger. The main event lived up to the hype, but the rest of the card was horrible. I mean, having Alex Morono versus Nico Price in a main card in 2024, that's when you know things are going downhill. It was a terrible fight between two old, washed fighters. It should not have been on a main card in 2024, especially when Jelton Almeida was on the prelims. So having that on a main card in 2024 was abysmal. It was a terrible fight. Strickland versus Costa was trash as well. Yeah, this fight had a lot of hype going into it. People thought it was going to be a banger, especially at the press conference, with Strickland saying that he's going to go to war for us and it's going to be an absolutely cracking fight. It was horrible. It was a boring fight. It was just Strickland walking down Costa, landing a jab and a teep to the body every now and then. And that was basically the story of the fight. It was boring. It was a terrible fight. And there was absolutely nothing memorable to come from this fight, apart from maybe at the end when, you know, Strickland went for Costa. But the entirety of the fight was pretty boring. It was a trash fight. So the co-main event didn't live up to the hype either. And the main card overall just completely sucked. I mean, if you look at the main card, I mean, there was only one good fight with Makhachev and Poirier. Price versus Morono, Strickland versus Costa was boring. There was a good submission from Kevin Holland against McCall. Randy Brown versus Aleksei dos Santos was made. There was more cheer for Donald Trump coming in than the actual fight itself. So the main card itself kind of sucked. And Jelton Almeida versus Alexander Romanov was the only good prelim performance. You know it's bad when Jelton Almeida, who's notorious for one of the most boring performances in UFC history, has the best prelim on UFC 302. You know it's bad. He basically, and when I say the best prelim, all he did was take Romanov down, take his back and get the submission. And that was the best performance from the UFC 302. So in my opinion, this was the worst pay-per-view of 2024. The only good thing to come from this pay-per-view was Jelton Almeida getting a finish in the prelims and Makhachev versus Poirier. Apart from that, terrible pay-per-view. And then I'm going to go UFC 297. We kicked off UFC 2024, not with a bang, but with a terrible card. Luckily, we got 311 kicking off 2025, but yeah, we had a bad start to the year with 297. It was rough. The good things to come from this pay-per-view is that Strickland versus Dricus was a decent fight again. The main event saved it. I'm noticing a bit of a theme as well. The two worst pay-per-views both involved Sean Strickland, but no, Strickland definitely allowed 297 to be a good fight, and so did Dricus. It was a good scrap between Dricus and Sean Strickland. They both brought it. I think their styles matched each other really well. You've got a walk-forward, basic fighter like Strickland against a scrappy fighter like Dricus du Plessis. So it was a really good fight. Went to a decision. It was a brawl back and forth. I didn't expect Dricus to make it the full 5 rounds, and he impressed me there. So the main event was really good, but again, that was pretty much the only good thing to come from this pay-per-view. There was a women's co-main event. Pennington versus Mara Bueno Silva might have been the worst title fight of 2024. It had no hype. Ever since Amanda Nunes left the women's bantamweight division, no one really cares about this division anymore. It was a boring fight. It wasn't anything special. I think it didn't really live up to the hype because it didn't have any hype in the first place. It ruined the card. Boring fight for 5 rounds straight. 25-minute piss break. Women's co-main event ruined the card. Mallet throw-checked by Gatekeeper Magny. So the only Canadian prospect in the UFC with Mike Mallet, who was on a bit of a winning streak, faces Neil Magny in his first true test. Dominates the entire fight, so it isn't even like Magny looked amazing. He got dominated the entire fight just for the last minute. Magny to turn the fight around and get a finish over Mike Mallet, and then go and lose his next 2 fights, so the win means absolutely nothing. So the only Canadian prospect in Mike Mallet ended up getting throw checked, and the card wasn't stacked. It wasn't even stacked coming into it, so it had no hype, and it had 0 memorable moments. The main card had 0 memorable moments. The only main memorable moment really from the main card was the knee from Arnold Allen in the fight with Movsar Evloev. And then even the prelims, I mean, there was barely any finishes throughout the entire prelim. So the card wasn't stacked. It had 0 memorable moments. I think it was the second worst pay-per-view of 2024. And then I'm going to go for UFC 307. You might be surprised again from how good the main event was. There's a lot of cards on this video that have really good main events, but the rest of the card just didn't deliver. This was one of them. Good thing about this pay-per-view, obviously, Poulton versus Roundtree was a really good fight. Roundtree had a lot of success early on, was actually winning the first 2 rounds of the fight. Managed to drop Poulton at one point point. So we brought a tough test for Porton in the light heavyweight division. Then eventually Porton entered the Matrix, got the finish over Khalil Roundtree. It was a back and forth bloody fight, really good fight, one of the best title fights this year. I'm going to go out and say amazing fight, one of the best fights of Porton's career. Great main event. There was also a solid KO from Buckley. Now obviously I don't like it when Stephen Wonderboy Thompson gets knocked out. He's one of the nicest dudes in the UFC, but I can't lie, it was a pretty solid knockout from Buckley as well. I don't think anyone really expected Buckley to be getting the knockout. Probably the best knockout against Wonderboy Thompson since Anthony Pettis as well. So solid knockout from Buckley, but again, that's kind of where the good things from this pay-per-view ends. I mean, apart from that, the rest of the main card was horrible to watch. You had Delidze versus Kevin Holland, which ended in an injury after the first round with Kevin Holland breaking his ribs so the fight couldn't continue. Pennington versus Pena. Again, Pennington on a card is never a good thing. It was a boring fight. It was a terrible fight. And to end things off, it was the wrong person getting rewarded the win. Juliana Pena did not win that fight and she got the win. So to end off a terrible fight, we had a robbery. We had Kayla Harrison versus Ketlen Vera, which I was actually excited to see Kayla Harrison compete. But again, it wasn't all that. There wasn't anything memorable from this fight. Ketlen Vera was able to survive the entire fight. She had pretty decent takedown defense. Kayla Harrison didn't look like this unstoppable force. We had Aldo versus Batista, one of the worst fights we've seen this year. Arguably worse from Aldo versus Marab, and Mario Batista becoming one of the most hated fighters of all time. So the rest of the main card was just horrible to watch, and there's nothing really notable to come from the prelims of this card. I mean, if you look at the prelims, there's nothing really notable. I mean, maybe Carla Esparza retiring from the card, Ryan Spann pulling off a submission. Nothing really notable on the prelims, and two women MMA fights on the main card. I mean, one women MMA fight on a main card is bad enough, but having two, yeah, definitely doesn't make for a good main card. Both went to a decision. Both were kind of uneventful and lackluster. So I'm going to go UFC 307 of the 12 worst. It kind of just looked like Dana didn't really put any effort into this pay-per-view, and it didn't really perform that well. Good main event, good fight from Buckley. Rest of the card had nothing notable. At number 11, I'm going to go with UFC 309, the last pay-per-view before 310, with Jones returning against Miocic. Now, good things to come from this pay-per-view is that Oliveira versus Chandler was a decent fight. It wasn't the war that they had the first time, but it was just pure domination from Charles Oliveira, taking down Michael Chandler, controlling him, nearly finishing him on the feet, and then eventually Michael Chandler nearly finishes Oliveira with about 50 back of the headshots, and then they had a fun fifth round where, obviously Chandler came back, started doing that whole thing where Oliveira gets on his back and he jumps on his back. So it was a pretty good fight between Charles Oliveira and Michael Chandler. Decent fight. I'd say that was the people's main event for UFC 309. There was also a lot of good prelim finishes. The prelims for UFC 309 were actually pretty good. We had Jim Miller back in the winning column beating Damon Jackson. Marcin Tybura destroying Denise. We had Mickey Gall getting knocked out by Brahim Marj. We ended up seeing Basil Havez get put to sleep by Auburn Elliott. So there's a lot of good prelim finishes on UFC 309 that kind of made the card what it was. And Mauricio Hoofy looked amazing as well, competed on the main card against James Lontop, and it was just vintage Mauricio Hoofy. Now, he couldn't get the finish, but I think that just shows for James Lontop's toughness, and plus he weighed in like 10 pounds heavier. But no, Mauricio Hoofy looked great in the fight, battered James Lontop, got back in the winning column. Not back in the winning column as if he took a loss, but won another fight. So those were the good things to come from UFC 309. But that was a very unnecessary main event. I'm not going to go over it now, but Jones versus Stipe should have been Jones versus Tom Aspinall. Stipe was in no shape to compete in this main event. Everyone, even at the press conference, people were chanting Aspinall in Jones' own press conference. So everyone knew that Aspinall should have been next. He went in as the backup, and it showed in the fight because Jon Jones completely dominated Stipe Miocic. Stipe looked slow, looked like he should have been nowhere near a title fight. So the main event was unnecessary, not really too much hype going into it anyway. And I mean, Jones performed well, but it was against Stipe at the end of the day. Nickel versus Craig sucked as well. I mean, I actually thought this was going to be a good fight between two high-level grapplers, but it ended up being a bit of a stand-up fight, and again, nothing really happened on the feet. It was just Paul Craig throwing a body kick, Bo Nickel coming in and landing a couple of shots on Paul Craig, and that was basically the story of the fight. So UFC 309, I'm going to put 11th as the 11th worst pay-per-view of 2024. Next up, I'm going to go UFC 303, another Porton main event. You might be surprised that there's some Porton fights in here, but it's not Porton that's making these cards bad. It's the rest of the card. The UFC just don't really seem to put too much effort in Porton main cards. Now, obviously, Pereira versus Yuri was amazing. This is probably one of Porton's, if not his best performance in the UFC. He nearly knocks out Yuri, or pretty much does at the end of the first round, and gets saved by the bell, just to come back and get him with a head kick right at the beginning in the first 5 seconds of the second round, and knocks out Yuri Braska. Great finish from Alex Pereira. One of the best finishes we've seen this year, where he completely just got rid of the rivalry with him and Yuri with one of his best knockouts of all time. And there was some solid finishes on the prelims. We had Peyton Talbot get a 20-second knockout. We had Joe Piper absolutely send Marc-Andre Barriault to sleep. We had Gene Silver get a KO from the Fighting Nerds when he knocked out Charles Jourdain. So there was a lot of good finishes on the prelims, especially between a lot of prospects. Lopez versus Ige, short notice, was decent. Obviously, it was supposed to be Ortega versus Lopez. Ended up not going through on 3 hours notice for the first time in UFC history. We had Dan Ige versus Diego Lopez, and it was a pretty decent fight. I'm not going to say it was a complete banger, because after the first round, it kind of lost a bit of momentum, but it was a very decent fight. They both brought it, especially in the first round. So Lopez versus Ige, short notice, was a decent fight, but again, that's kind of where the good things about UFC 303 end off. The rest of the main card was trash. Anthony Smith versus Roman Dolidze was a completely boring fight. It was basically nothing the entire fight. Any Anthony Smith fight is terrible in 2024, and that's exactly what this fight showed. Smith couldn't even beat a middleweight. We had Macy Chiasson versus Mara Bueno Silva, which was starting to heat up, and then again ended prematurely because of a cut on Mara Bueno Silva, so we didn't get to see that fight. Ian Gary versus Michael Venom Page was a very boring fight as well, with just Ian Gary clinging onto MVP for dear life, and then he gets a decision win at the end of it rather than getting the good fight that we also thought we were going to see. So apart from the decent fight between Ige and Lopez and the good fight between Porton and Yuri, the main card sucked for UFC 303, and it wasn't even a stacked card on paper. It was supposed to be a McGregor versus Chandler main event, and obviously the UFC don't really stack McGregor cards, so having Bueno Silva versus Chiasson and Smith versus Dolidze on a pay-per-view main card, it's never going to be a great card. So I'm going to put UFC 303 at 10th. It's definitely not one of the worst necessarily, but I wouldn't want a pay-per-view like 303 again. Good main event from Porton, and he did save the show. I'm glad that he actually got to save the show, and they had Lopez versus Ige on short notice. But apart from that, wasn't a great pay-per-view. At 9th, I'm going to go UFC 301. Quite possibly the most underrated pay-per-view of the year. Now, I'm not going to put it anything over number 9 for obvious reasons, but most people say that this is the worst card of the year. Now, what they really mean is it just was the least stacked card of the year, which I agree with, but it wasn't even that bad of a card. I mean, you've got Pantoja versus Usyk, which was a great fight. Yeah, Usyk versus Pantoja. Obviously, a lot of people thought Usyk was going to get destroyed in this fight, and it was actually a scrap. Pantoja did really well. Usyk did really well too. Usyk, a lot of people thought, won the fight. It was just a back-and-forth scrap between Steve Usyk and Pantoja. They both did well with grappling. They both did well with stand-up. It was a very close fight with Pantoja winning a decision. I thought it was a really good main event. We also had Jose Aldo make a comeback to the UFC. So obviously, Aldo retired after getting basically held up against the cage against Marab for 3 rounds straight. Ended up retiring there and then. Comes back to the UFC against Jonathan Martinez in a comeback no one really saw coming, against a Martinez that was on a winning streak too. And Aldo looked amazing in this fight. The ribs to the body, his boxing looked, extremely crisp. He was out striking Martinez just to end it off with a bit of grappling in the 3rd round to cement the win in Rio as well, in his hometown as well. So having a Jose Aldo come back on this card made it even better for UFC 301. We had a Mauricio Hufi masterclass debut. Yeah, Mauricio Hufi only debuted at UFC 301. We had the debut of Mauricio Hufi against Jamie Mullarkey, and he looked vintage in this fight. Super crafty. I mean, that scissor sweep as well that he had against Jamie Mullarkey was just insane. One of the most crafty fighters in the UFC's Mauricio Hufi, and I think he displayed it really good in this fight with Jamie Mullarkey. Finished him in the 1st round with a beautiful knee too. We had a Mauricio Hufi masterclass. Caio Bralo knocking out Paul Craig to make it into the rankings. Yeah, this was basically just Caio Bralo bouncing the head off Paul Craig. Paul Craig's striking defense is horrible. It was only a matter of time before he was going to get knocked out, and then eventually Caio Bralo lands a big shot, puts Paul Craig to sleep in Brazil. But I will say, it's not just a complete perfect pay-per-view. We got robbed of Brito versus Shaw. This was going to be a really good fight. Joanderson Brito versus Jack Shaw. It started off well as too. I mean, Joanderson Brito was absolutely destroying the legs of Jack Shaw. Some of the most damaging leg kicks we've seen this year. So bad to the point where it actually cut a hole in Jack Shaw's leg to the point where the fight had to be stopped early. And I will admit, it wasn't stacked on paper, so there was barely any hype. I feel like for a pay-per-view, you've got to have some sort of hype for it to be for it to be an interesting pay-per-view. And Pantoja headlining a pay-per-view for the first time didn't really, the fans weren't really a big fan of it. It had a pretty underwhelming main card. The entire card as a whole is probably the least stacked card this year. People were saying it was going to be, a big fight. Now, there was only a handful of ranked fighters. Pantoja, Craig, Martinez, Smith, and Usyk were the only ranked fighters competing on a pay-per-view card. People were saying it was a stacked fight night card, and in my opinion, it just wasn't really pay-per-view worthy. So I will admit, if you are a bit of a casual fan, I can understand why this doesn't really appeal to you and why it doesn't have high pay-per-view buys. But I thought there was a lot of good fights on it, but I can't really put it anything higher than number 9 because of the fact that it just wasn't really stacked for a pay-per-view. Number 8, I'm going to go UFC 304. I think people kind of like, I'm a UK guy, you know, you've got UK fighters competing on this card, but I personally didn't think it was that good of a pay-per-view. I mean, the good things about this card was that Aspinall demolished Curtis Blades. I'd say Aspinall is probably the biggest representative for the UK right now in MMA. He fought in the UK against Curtis Blades, a guy that has beaten him before. And he looked amazing. Knocked him down with a jab, went for the finish with ground and pound, finished him, rocks the mic after. And it's just good seeing Tom Aspinall win in the UFC. He's one of my favourite fighters. I think a lot of MMA fans have Aspinall as one of the favourite fighters just because of how funny he is in the octagon and how just of a likeable guy he is on the mic as well. So Aspinall demolishing Blades in the co-main event to get the interim belt, which, let's be honest, John Jones didn't really want to happen. Jones was hoping that Blades was going to beat Tom Aspinall, so it was kind of good to see John Jones not say anything on Twitter. Pimlet brutalized Bobby Green. Yeah, I heard a lot of people, including myself, to be fair, saying that Bobby Green was going to beat Paddy Pimlet, and he shut all those people up. Everyone's saying that Bobby Green was going to smoke Pimlet. Pimlet got his first ranked fight, and he did amazing. Got Bobby Green in a triangle, choked him out, and then as he was unconscious, then ends up breaking his arm, or I think he dislocated his arm with an armbar. One of the most brutal fights we've had this year from Paddy Pimlet. Sent Bobby Green straight into unconsciousness, and then rocks him out after calling out Renato Moicano, which obviously hasn't happened now, but it was a good call out anyway. So Pimlet brutalizing Green in his best UFC performance in the UK. Another good performance. Allen versus Giga Chikadze was a banger as well, which is to be expected. You've got Giga Chikadze, a kickboxer, versus Arnold Allen, a guy who just comes to scrap. It was a really good fight. They both had a lot of success. Giga had success early on. Arnold Allen started to turn up a bit later on. The third round was really good. It was back and forth, mainly from Allen. So Allen versus Giga Chikadze was a banger. But the first bad thing is that Makayev versus Cap didn't really live up to the hype. This was supposed to be a really good fight. It was a massive rivalry. They were fighting backstage in the UFC before the fight. They were trying to fight each other at the weigh-ins. Even minutes before they were in the octagon, they were trying to throw it at each other and fight. Security had to separate them. And then the fight starts, and you would not have known that they had a rivalry because it was a terrible fight. They were both just kind of fainting on the feet and throwing a leg kick every 20 seconds. When Makayev does take Manel Cap down, he grabs his short so he loses position. It was a really boring fight between Makayev and Manel Cap, and for the rivalry that they had, you would have expected it to be a lot more. People were complaining that it wasn't on the main card. Well, after that performance, I'm glad that that wasn't on the main card, because that would have been terrible on a pay-per-view. And there was just a bunch of stale decisions in the middle of the card. I mean, I think there was a period of like 6 straight fights of just pure decisions, which obviously didn't look good for the pay-per-view. And there was just a lot of boring fights that didn't really have anything going for them. Fights that, you know, and this was in the UK as well, in American time zone. So the UK fans were watching this at 4 and 5 a.m. and 3 a.m. for the prelims. And you've got to remember, like, they're watching these prelims at like 2 a.m. in the morning. And then there are a bunch of stale decisions with nothing going on. There's no wonder the crowd weren't going. And it just wasn't that good either. I mean, Leon versus Bilal was depressing too. Now, obviously, Bilal had a really dominant performance, but you've got Leon Edwards, who at the time was probably the UK's biggest representative for the UFC. And he gets dominated by Bilal Muhammad. Bilal Muhammad completely crushes Leon Edwards, ruins every fan of the UK in that arena, ends up winning the belt, and it just kind of left a bad energy in the after the event as well, because Dana White was in a bad mood, started talking trash to everyone, even, you know, sacked Muhammad Makayev after the card. It was in 5 a.m. local time, so the crowd couldn't really get going. I remember more bad things from good things to come from UFC 304, so I'm going to put it at 8. It wasn't a terrible pay-per-view. We had some good moments as I've just went over, but I feel like from top to bottom, it wasn't that good of a pay-per-view. At number 7, I'm going to go UFC 306 in the Sophia that we had not too long ago. Now, the main good thing to come from UFC 306, which is pretty obvious, is the Sophia. It was the star of the show. I'd say it's probably the greatest venue of all time. The Sophia in UFC 306, it's kind of like a one-in-a-lifetime UFC event. You had to be there type of event. You had to be there to watch this live, and it was insane. I mean, the graphics for this event, it didn't even feel like a UFC event. It felt like a modern-day gladiator battle that happens to have UFC fights on. The Sophia is, like I just said, the greatest venue of all time, in my opinion. It's a shame we're only going to get it once, but because of the Sophia, it definitely pushes UFC 306 high on this list. It was an amazing event because of the Sophia. That was the most memorable thing to come from this card. We also had arguably the greatest fight of all time, or one of the greatest fights of all time. Definitely a fight of the year contender with Daniel Zeluber and Esteban Ribovics. The first 2 rounds were just an absolute scrap between Zeluber and Ribovics, but then in that 3rd round specifically, for Zeluber to begin in the round by dropping Ribovics, and then Ribovics to come back, become like seconds away from finishing Zeluber. It was just a back and forth scrap. That wasn't like a period of 5 seconds where they weren't just trading and throwing punches. This was one of the greatest fights of all time, and to have it in the Sphere at UFC 306, this definitely boosts UFC 306 up there. Odi Osbourne versus Ronaldo Rodriguez was amazing too. This didn't really have that much hype going into it. A lot of people were complaining about the fact that this was on the main card. Well, it definitely performed. Odi Osbourne dropped Ronaldo Rodriguez, nearly finished him, nearly got him with a triangle too, just for Ronaldo Rodriguez to come back, get his own back on Odi Osbourne, look really good in that fight. So that was another amazing fight that a lot of people kind of counted out for the main card of 306. But the main card, the main and the co-main event kind of let the card down in my opinion. We had Grasso versus Shevchenko 3, which I don't think people were necessarily excited for, but we were expecting it to be a decent fight between two people who have had decent fights before. And it was essentially just Shevchenko out-wrestling Grasso for the majority of the time, having the control time, not even beating her with ground and pound or doing anything dominant with the grappling. It was just Shevchenko simply out-grappling Alexa Grasso for 5 rounds straight. Nothing significant really came from this. Grasso had a terrible performance, so the co-main event was bad. In the main event, it wasn't necessarily a boring fight between O'Malley and Merab, but O'Malley couldn't really do anything on the feet, and it was just Merab taking down O'Malley again, not doing anything significant with the takedowns, kind of just getting control time over him, letting him back up, and then immediately shooting another takedown, winning the belt in the Sphere as well. So I feel like the main and the co-main event really let this card down. I don't think they were expected to be absolute bangers anyway, but I just think they weren't really that good of a fight to watch. And there was only a few fights on this card. I'm pretty sure this was the pay-per-view with the least amount of fights. I don't know how many exactly, but there weren't too many fights for this. There was obviously 5 fights on the main card, 4 on the prelims, and then 1 early prelim with Raul Rosas Jr. So it didn't really have that many fights, but I put UFC 306 at number 7. Definitely very memorable because of the Sphere and the fact that it had one of the greatest fights of all time. At number 6, I'm going to go UFC 298. You might think I'm kind of downplaying this card. I know a lot of people put this in their top 4, but I'll explain why it's at number 6, and there's obviously some cards that I think are better than this. But UFC 298, Topuria makes featherweight history with the Volk knockout. Now, obviously, it isn't good to see Alexander Volkanovski get knocked out in 2024, or just in general, but Topuria made history, becoming the first guy to beat Alexander Volkanovski in the featherweight division, and obviously knock him out in the featherweight division to make history, and become the featherweight champion. It was a dominant performance from Ilia Topuria. The main event was really fun because of it. Not fun as a Volkanovski fan, but to see Topuria become the champion, beat the guy that no featherweight has ever been able to beat, kind of reminded me a bit of McGregor and Aldo, where Aldo was the unstoppable guy. McGregor ends up knocking him out. And this was getting compared to that fight a lot in the build-up too, so I think Topuria knocking out Volk, making featherweight history, was definitely a good moment to come from this pay-per-view. Another one, Merab bullied Cejudo. It was kind of satisfying to see Merab just go out there and bully Henry Cejudo. He was out wrestling the wrestler in Henry Cejudo, picking him up, putting him in the center of the octagon, slamming him down, beating him with ground and pound, laughing at Mark Zuckerberg in the middle of the fight. This was an embarrassing performance from Henry Cejudo. Merab was just having fun the entire time. Cejudo couldn't get going. And for a guy like Cejudo, who's just kind of irritating to me, it was kind of fun to see Merab bullying the entire fight. Hernandez submitting Kopylov as well. Hernandez has to be one of the most underrated fighters in the UFC. He was a huge underdog coming into this fight. Maybe not a huge underdog, but Kopylov was definitely the big favorite. He was the big prospect in this fight. And Hernandez takes him down, gets the back, gets the rear naked choke, and chokes him unconscious. And I'm pretty sure this was his first time on a pay-per-view main card as well. So seeing Hernandez, who is probably one of my favorite prospects in the UFC, get the submission over Roman Kopylov was fun to see. He's such a fun grappler, and he displayed it in this fight. Whittaker versus Costa was a solid fight too. Obviously, Costa nearly knocks out Robert Whittaker with a head kick at the beginning of the 3rd round. Whittaker got saved by the bell. If that first round would have been 20 seconds longer, maybe Costa would have got him out of there. But then Whittaker comes back and picks apart Costa for the rest of the fight. Costa couldn't really get going. Whittaker was kind of just picking him apart, outlanding him, and he gets back in the winning column for the first time after obviously losing to Dricus du Plessis. So Whittaker versus Costa, solid fight in the middleweight division between two guys that we expected to have a solid fight. However, Gary versus Neal, in my opinion, was very underwhelming. You've got a good boxer in Jeff Neal and this prospect in Ian Gary, who was coming off that dominant performance over Jeff Neal. I expected a little bit of a better performance between the two of them. Not Jeff Neal, Neil Magny, I mean. But no, Jeff Neal and Ian Gary, it was just a lot of clinching from Ian Gary, and when they were striking, it was just mainly feinting each other out, feeling each other out. Gary landing a leg kick, Jeff Neal pressuring Ian Gary with nothing really significant happening. So I feel like that fight was kind of underwhelming, and the prelims sucked for UFC 298. I mean, again, there was nothing really notable to come from the entire prelims, and I feel like prelims are very important. It might have actually had some of the worst prelims of a pay-per-view in 2024, but UFC 298, in my opinion, top 6 best we've had. If a little bit more would have gone on in the prelims, and maybe if Gary versus Neal would have overperformed, then this could have gone higher. But I'll put it at number 6 for 298. At number 5, I'm going to go UFC 305. In my opinion, one of the most underrated pay-per-views of 2024. This card was just straight violence. I mean, you had the main event between Dricus du Plessis finishing Izzy. Listen, I'm not going to be one of these people that over-hates on Adesanya for the sake of hating Adesanya, but it was kind of satisfying. Dricus du Plessis just absolutely tearing out Adesanya in Fight Week, making him cry, and then just effortlessly taking Adesanya down in the 4th round, kind of just flopping him down to the floor, getting the rear naked choke, and pulling off a finish in a fight that he was losing, like Dricus normally does. It was satisfying. I wanted Dricus du Plessis to win, and he got the win, and stayed the champion. Hooker versus Gamrot, fight of the year contender, which I don't think anyone really looked at that fight was expected it to be a fight of the year contender, but it was. Hooker was doing very well in this fight, did a lot better than people expected. Gamrot did a lot better than people expected on the feet, and obviously mixing up with the grappling. Hooker did really well in this fight, did a lot better than people expected, I've just said for like the 5th time. But no, it was a back and forth fight between the two of them, very, very close, hard to score. Hooker ends up getting the win in Australia. You couldn't have asked for a better fight between Hooker and Gamrot. Seeing Dan Hooker as well get a win in Australia, it was a good thing to see. We had Kai Kara-France come back with a knockout win over Steve Erceg. Now, when this fight was first booked, Steve Erceg had a lot of hype because he just had that very close performance over Pantoja for the title fight. But Kai Kara-France came back and shocked everyone. Landed a massive shot on Steve Erceg in round 1, drops him, follows up, ends up putting him pretty much out cold. So seeing Kai Kara-France come back, because at this point in time, Kai Kara-France hadn't competed in like over a year, and his last performance was a robbery loss over Amir Albazi. To see him come back and get that solid win over Steve Erceg was good to see. I told you, man, this card was just straight violence. Prates as well, dominantly knocking out Li Jingliang in the prelims. Again, it's not fun to see Li Jingliang lose, but I can't lie, Carlos Prates is one of the best welterweight prospects, and he completely slaughtered and butchered Li Jingliang this entire fight. I'm pretty sure he was the first guy to knock out Li Jingliang in UFC history too, so solid win from Carlos Prates, just bullying Li Jingliang. The bad things to come from this pay-per-view is that we had to watch Taito Ivaza lose again. This was Taito Ivaza on his 5th straight loss in a row. Now, fair enough, it wasn't a finish, but Rosenstrike was outstriking Taito Ivaza, and it's kind of just disappointed to see Tuivasa how he hasn't really progressed in any of his past couple of fights. Rosenstrike cruised to a decision, beat Tuivasa in his own country. And another bad thing to come from this fight as well is that the judge that gave Tuivasa 30-27, as much as I like Tuivasa, there isn't a world where he should have won that fight 30-27. So the judge kind of fucked up the judging too. But the fact that we had to watch Tuivasa lose again, in my opinion, kind of brings this card down a bit. But UFC 305 was just pure violence. I really enjoyed it. One of the most underrated pay-per-views this year. And number 4, I'm going to go with the pay-per-view that we've just had, UFC 310. I hear a lot of people calling this a trash card, calling this a bad pay-per-view. I think this was an insane pay-per-view. The first reason is there was just tons of finishes throughout the entire card. The early prelims had 4 finishes. I'm pretty sure they're all in the early prelims anyway. We had, obviously, Chase Hooper submit Clay Guida, Kennedy Nezakuku knock out Lucas Brzezinski, Marco Chiesa got a submission, Eric Anders finished Chris Weidman on the prelims. We had Vicente Luque beat Tim McGregor in 50 seconds, leading Mark Hold. Dominic Reyes finish Anthony Smith. On the main card, we had Duho Choi destroying Nate Landwehr, Bryce Mitchell send Kron Gracie unconscious, Pantoja submit Kaya Sakura. And there was only like a handful of decisions. I mean, how many? Like 5 decisions on a card that had, I'm pretty sure, 14 fights. Shows that there was a lot of finishes. Shows that it was a pretty good card. So there was just tons of finishes throughout the entire card. I'm pretty sure out of every pay-per-view this year, this was one of the cards that had the most finishes on it. And Pantoja dominated Kai Sakura. I wanted Pantoja to win. He was representing the UFC. And coming into this, he had 3 straight decisions. A lot of people kind of disrespecting Pantoja and his finishing ability. You know, saying that he has close fights no matter who he gets put against. Well, this wasn't a close fight. Pantoja dominated him, dropped him in the first round, nearly took him down and got the submission there and then. Kaya Sakura was doing well, but it was definitely Pantoja outlanding him on the feet. And then in that second round, gets the back of Kaya Sakura, chokes him out unconscious, and gets back in the winning. Well, I keep saying gets back in the winning column. He was winning anyway, but wins another fight. Yeah, dominant performance from Pantoja. In my opinion, the greatest flyweight of the modern era. And yeah, just dominated the newcomer in Kaya Sakura, showing that there's levels to the UFC. Duho Choi looked great as well. Duho Choi is probably one of my favorite. I want to call him a prospect, but he's been in the UFC for so long. He's taken a few losses, but in his past couple of fights, he's looked really good. And he goes out there against Nate Landwehr and destroys him. It wasn't even a brawl like we thought it was going to be. He immediately asserts dominance in that first round by just tagging Nate Landwehr. And his shots look so powerful. Was outboxing him the entirety of the first round. And even in the grappling department, takes him down. And Landwehr's a grappler. Takes him down, gets him in crucifix position, bullies and batters Nate Landwehr. And he looked great. Great performance for the main card. And again, like I said before, this might have had some of the best prelims we've had of the entire year. I can't think of a card apart from maybe like 300 that had better prelims than 310. I mean, like I said, not only the amount of finishes we had in the prelims on this card, but having Evelo Evans Sterling on the prelims, Randy Brown versus Brian Battle, Van versus Durden. Yeah, Smith versus Reyes. This was some stacked prelims. Like I said, apart from 300, might have been the most stacked prelims of the entire year. So they had goated prelims, and they all got most of them were finishes as well. The bad things to come from this pay-per-view: Gordon, Robin, Volkov. Yeah, this really rubbed me the wrong way. Gordon, Robin, Volkov. I actually picked Volkov to win if I haven't made it clear already. You know, Volkov was my guy. I was picking him to win, and to see the judges go out there and rob Volkov, it was sad to see. Volkov was outlanding him in that second round. I think I'll give the first round to Cyril Gane, but the second and the third was definitely a Volkov win. But he outgrappled him in the third to see. And even Gane didn't think he won. Gane in his own corner didn't think he won that fight. To see Volkov get robbed against Cyril Gane. And Volkov's such a likable guy as well. You just kind of want to see him succeed in the UFC. But no, they give it to Cyril Gane. A guy's had one of the most gifted careers in the UFC. Getting a title shot from Derek Lewis and then Tato Ivaza. And then getting a robbery win over Alexander Volkov. Yeah, just wasn't a good thing to see. I wish they gave Volkov that win. If they'd have given Volkov that win, this main card would have been gutted, but they had to find a way to fuck it up. They robbed Volkov, gave it to Gane. It is what it is. And there's a few boring fights on this card. Brian Battle versus Randy Brown didn't really live up to the hype I thought he was going to get. Bryce Mitchell versus Kron Gracie up until the finish was extremely boring. And I'm not going to say that Rakhmonov versus Gary was boring, but it was definitely a slow starting fight. There was just a lot of clinch work where nothing really was going on. So there was a few boring fights in UFC 310, but because of the amount of finishes on the card and the fact that it was so consistent from top to bottom, I'm going to put UFC 310, the last pay-per-view of the year, and number 4, real good pay-per-view. Now the top 3. At number 3, I'm going to go UFC 299. To have this in UFC 300 back-to-back was insane. But no, I'm going to go 299 at number 3. First reason, O'Malley just battered Marlon Vera the entire fight. He didn't get the finish, but that's just credit to Vera's toughness. This was a dominant performance that neither he landed on Marlon Vera. The entire fight was just Sean O'Malley picking apart Marlon Vera, beating him like a punching bag, made him look like the dude from Home Alone. It was just a dominant performance from Sean O'Malley from start to finish, showing that there's levels to this, and Vera got an undeserved title shot going into this. I know he beat O'Malley before, but it was because of an injury, so it was kind of satisfying to see Vera get beaten. And not that I don't like Vera, but it was just satisfying to see a dominant performance from Sean O'Malley, battering Marlon Vera for 5 rounds straight, and putting on arguably his best performance. Poirier, Frochik, and Bamos Anthony. I'm so glad that Poirier won this one. I picked him to win, and I'm just so glad that Poirier got the win. It's never good when you see kind of like a legend of the UFC get beating guys, some up-and-coming guy, and this was one of those fights where I really wanted Poirier to win, and he did just that, especially coming off that knockout loss to Gaethje. Seeing him go out there and knock out Ben Moore, that he's Frochek him, get back in the winning column, it was satisfying to see from Dustin Poirier. MVP UFC debuted on this card, and he did it in style, where he had that fight with Kevin Holland. A lot of questions of how good MVP was going to be in the UFC. People calling him a can crusher, and he looked really good. He obviously got scheduled to fight Holland. He looked really good in this fight. Very crafty on the feet. He's MVP, one of the most unique strikers in the UFC. Got the win in his UFC debut against Kevin Holland, and I'd say a pretty fun fight to see. So he debuted in style. Curtis Blades shutting down Jailton Almeida. I celebrated so hard when Curtis Blades beat Jailton Almeida, because Almeida, he was coming off that really boring fight to Derek Lewis. Everyone kind of disliked his style, and that was kind of going on for the beginning of the fight with Curtis Blades, until eventually Blades decided that he had enough and just started raining down ground and pound from hell, finishing Jailton Almeida, slowing down his run. And as a Curtis Blades fan, it was good to see that, finishing Curtis Blades, finishing Jailton Almeida at the end of the first round, at the beginning of the second round, end of the prelims. So that was another good thing I liked about this pay-per-view. Jack Della Maddalena knocking out Gilbert Burns. Now, it's never good to see Gilbert Burns lose, but it was a solid knockout from Jack Della Maddalena. Cemented himself as a top contender, went out there and brutally finished Gilbert Burns with a knee and then ground and pound. To seeing JDM become a top contender, solid performance from him. And PTN back in the winning column too. Now, PTN coming into UFC 299, he'd lost 4 of his last 5 fights. He was on a 3-fight losing streak, just got dominated by Merab. And he looked really good in that fight with Song Yadong. He was mainly out-grappling him for the majority of the fight. I'd say he lost the first round, but definitely picked it up in the later rounds. Was doing really good with the grappling, was doing really good on the feet. So seeing PTN finally get back in the winning column was good to see. But regardless, 299, one of the best pay-per-views this year, but I don't think it takes the number 2 spot, because at number 2, I'm going UFC 308. Topuria versus Holloway is the second best pay-per-view of 2024. First reason, Topuria versus Holloway lived up to the hype. I don't think I've ever been as hyped for a title fight as I was with Topuria versus Holloway. They were so evenly matched coming into this fight. There was so much hype coming into it. People were excited for the main event. Fight of the year, and it lived up to it. It did very well. Holloway did very well in the first round, kind of outlanding Topuria. Topuria mixed it up with grappling and then just knocked out Max Holloway. First guy to ever knock out Max Holloway in UFC history. Made history, became pound for pound one of the best. First guy to, well, had one of the best back-to-back wins in UFC history with Volkan Holloway. Topuria may live in history. It was an amazing main event. Lived up to the hype. We got the finish that we were all expecting. So the main event between Topuria and Holloway, great main event. We saw Chimaev more Robert Whittaker again. It's not not fun to see Whittaker lose. He's one of my favorite fighters in the UFC, at least from a personality perspective, but this was just vintage Chimaev. Shot a takedown, mauled Robert Whittaker within seconds, had him in the neck crank, and broke his jaw dominantly. So seeing Chimaev back in the winning column against Robert Whittaker, I keep saying back in the winning column as if they lost their previous fights, but seeing Chimaev win in his best performance yet was cool to see Chimaev, and I hope he does get a title shot in his next fight. Orobai versus Rumbetsky fight of the year. If you ain't going to give Zeluba versus Rebevich fight of the year, you've got to give it to this. This was such a fun fight. I'm still so confused on how Orobai survived that third round. Yeah, Rumbetsky looked amazing. He was absolutely battering Orobai like a punching bag, but Orobai was swinging back. He was walking forward. He was landing his own shots. This was just a brutal fight that could have been finished at like 10 different times, and it didn't. Rumbetsky got the rightful decision. I'd say this is probably the second best fight of the year, if not the best fight of the year behind Zeluba and Rebevich. Amazing third round. Orobai's tough as nails. I don't know how he didn't get finished. Murphy versus Ige was fun as well. I feel like this fight kind of goes under the radar. Murphy, no one really remembers him in the featherweight division. A lot of people kind of overlooking this fight, but it was really good. Dan Ige nearly slept Laurel Murphy in that first round. Murphy came back and started trading with Dan Ige. There was fun grappling moments as well, but it was mainly an on-the-feet fight. They were both trading, they were both swinging, they were both landing shots. The only reason there wasn't much hype around it was because the crowd were terrible, but I think Murphy versus Ige was a fun little scrap. Underrated in my opinion, and it added to the main card. Extremely stacked as well. I'd say UFC 308 is probably the second most stacked card of the year, just behind UFC 300. I mean, look at the main card. Sharamagomedov Petrosian, Ankalaev versus Rakic, Murphy Ige, Whittaker Chimaev, Topuria Max Holloway. As a main card is insane. And even the prelims, Jeff Neal versus Rafael dos Santos, Bruno Ferreira versus Abbas Magomedov, an insane fight. Kenny Nzechukwu versus the GOAT Chris Barnett. The prelims were really good. I mean, I've not even mentioned the Sharamagomedov fight yet, which also added to the main card. It was an extremely stacked card going into it, one of the best of the year. And originally it had Garn versus Volkov as well, which obviously got rescheduled to 310, but that was also supposed to be in this card, which would have just made it ridiculously stacked. And there was just a bunch of good moments throughout the entire card. You had Bruno Ferreira nearly knock out Abbas Magomedov, and then Abbas Magomedov come back with a submission. You had Ibo Aslan destroy Sakura. You had, like I said, the fight of the year between Orobai and Rumbetsky. There was just a bunch of good moments from the prelims to the main card. And I think UFC 308, in my opinion, is the second best card of the year. But I don't think anything can top UFC 300 at number one. It's a once-in-a-lifetime pay-per-view. It's one of those pay-per-views where you kind of like, you had to be there. There was multiple reasons why this is, in my opinion, not only the best pay-per-view of 2024, but the greatest card of all time in UFC history. First reason, like I said, the most stacked card in UFC history. Just take a look at the card. I mean, to open up the card with Figueiredo and Cody Garbrandt, I mean, that just shows you kind of how stacked the card is. It's the most stacked card from top to bottom. The main card, the prelims, most stacked card in UFC history. You cannot find a card more stacked than this. Every single one of the fights, apart from maybe Jessica and Georgia Marine Rodriguez, could have been a fight night main event. It was extremely stacked. Second reason, Holloway versus Gaethje moment. Not only is it the greatest card of all time, it produced the greatest moment in MMA history. Holloway putting down to the middle of the octagon, then both swinging down, knocking Gaethje out unconscious. I think this still remains and will remain for a long time the greatest moment in UFC history. Just the event itself, being on UFC 300, how tense this fight was, how high level this fight was, the fact that it was between Gaethje and Holloway after a war. They end it off by putting in the middle, swinging down, throwing down, Holloway sending him to unconsciousness. It's the greatest MMA moment of all time, and it took place on UFC 300. And now you see every time the fight's got 10 seconds left, everyone wants to kind of copy Holloway, put it in the middle and swing down. But it's never going to live up to the moment of Holloway Gaethje. Porto knocking out Jamal Hill as well. This was satisfying to see. Obviously, Jamal Hill losing is a satisfying thing to see. To see Porto go out and do it, get the groin shot, tell the ref to stand back, hit him with the left hook, and then beat him up with ground and pound and get the main event finish. To end the card off with a first round finish from Porto knocking out Hill, satisfying to see. And there was just so many amazing moments throughout the entire prelims. It's not just one of those cards that is stacked on paper but doesn't perform it, because it performed as well. I mean, like I said, you started off the card with Figueiredo submitting Cody Garbrandt. You had Bobby Green brutalize Jim Miller. You had Yuri versus Rakic, which was a massive comeback from Yuri finishing Rakic. Holly Holm getting absolutely dominated by Kayla Harrison. Diego Lopez knocking out Sadiq Yusuf. Renato Moicano coming back and beating Jalin Turner. There was just so many amazing moments throughout the prelims that I think made this card even better. It wasn't just a main card heavy fight. The entire card was stacked from top to bottom, like I said. And there was only one boring fight on the entire card, when the only boring fight on the entire card is Sterling versus Cater. you know that it's a good card. Most pay-per-views have multiple boring fights. This had one. I mean, I guess Marina Rodriguez versus Jessica and Georgia can kind of call that boring as well, but from my memory, Sterling versus Keita was the only bad card. But that is how I would rank every UFC pay-per-view that took place in 2024. Let me know if you agree or disagree with the placements, what you would personally rank each pay-per-view. But yeah, thank you for watching.